The distress call came in at 3 in the morning, while we were all sleeping. Nolan was an early riser, and he was the one who went from hotel room to hotel room, urgently waking up the rest of us after he saw the message on his work phone. 3 simple letters, offering no explanation, but telling us that our help was urgently needed. SOS. The adrenaline rush ensured that no one was still half asleep or in need of coffee when we convened in Rebecca's hotel room, which had been doubling as our conference center for when we would have to make calls back to the university or just meet amongst ourselves. We were archaeologists stationed in Cairo, the capital of Egypt, very close to the iconic pyramids which define most the thought that pops into most people's minds when they think of this land. In particular, we were tasked with studying potential ancient Egyptian settlements that lay beyond the immediate reach of the Nile River. Aside from some very rudimentary urban areas that were centered around oases, ancient Egyptian civilization was completely dependent on the Nile, relying on its nutrient-rich waters to sustain its agricultural economy. So when recent satellite images showed potential ruins right in the middle of the desert, far from the Nile or any known current or ancient oases, our archaeological team was sent to investigate. The day before, 4 of us, Christine, Daniel, Cameron, and Greg had packed all the supplies they would need for an overnight trip. The location was supposed to be a 6-hour drive through the desert from Cairo, just long enough for them to do a preliminary survey of the site and drive back to report any findings to the whole group the next day so we could figure out how to proceed. Rather than arriving back at the planned time of 6 in the morning, they sent a distress call using their emergency satellite phone at around 3 in the morning. "We need to go out for them," Rebecca said, her voice commanding and unwavering as always. "We don't know what happened. We have to tell the police or the army or..." "To hell with that," said Rebecca, cutting Nolan off. "Unless we pay them with half our budget, they're going to take their sweet time. No, we're going out. Start loading up the truck." Without another word, Nolan and I started loading up our truck with enough water, food, and petrol to get us through 2 days in the desert. Rebecca grabbed our emergency satellite phone to keep trying to establish contact with the group that had gone missing. Within an hour of driving west, the last bits of Cairo that we could see had disappeared from the rearview mirror, and we were driving straight through the desert and over sand dunes in the direction of the satellite coordinates we received at the beginning of the expedition. On the way, we spoke about every possibility of what could have happened, although nothing was fitting the circumstances. If they had just run out of gas or if their vehicle had broken down, they would still be able to answer their satellite phone or send a message more descriptive than just SOS. We were at a loss of what else could have happened besides their vehicle breaking down. The location was far from civilization. The nomads that occasionally passed through the area weren't known for being hostile, and there were no known terrorist groups in the area. At that moment, I realized something that didn't particularly stand out to me, but now looking back on it, should have been a clear warning sign. The sun wasn't as bright as it usually is. We were right in the middle of the desert, with no clouds or large trees in sight that would have been blocking the sun's rays. While I momentarily thought it odd, I didn't give it much more thought. I was, after all, a man of science and reason. Until that day, superstition and mythology to me were nothing more than interesting historical footnotes to consider when contextualizing archaeological finds. How I now longed for those blissful, ignorant days. Once we were only an hour away from the coordinates of the research site, Rebecca asked Nolan to slow down. About 100 meters away, she spotted a person walking on the sand dunes. We changed directions to approach them. Maybe they knew where our friends were or just needed help themselves. After all, it was highly unusual for someone to be just walking out in the desert this far away from any form of civilization, especially without a camel or any form of transportation. "Hello," Rebecca yelled out in Arabic after we had driven close enough that we could get out and walk towards the stranger. He obviously heard us as he paused for a moment, but didn't turn around to face us and just kept limping forward. Rebecca called out to him in Coptic this time, thinking he may not have understood Arabic. Again, he just paused and then continued on limping. Growing both impatient and concerned, Rebecca ran fast enough to get in front of him to look at him directly. As soon as her face met his, she gasped and covered an expression of shock with her hands. He paused, facing her. After what was probably only a moment but seemed longer, Nolan and I caught up to them to see what Rebecca was seeing. He had no eyes. Where there should have been 2 eyeballs were just black holes in his face, and he had dried streaks of blood going down from where his eyes used to be down his cheeks. His mouth was slightly open, but he had nothing to say. His lip was just trembling. The poor man was obviously traumatized. We stood in front of this man in silence for only a few moments, but it seemed much longer than that. Then he started to fumble around us, and Rebecca grabbed the man by the arm and put it around her shoulder to prop him up. I got on his other side and put his other arm around my shoulder so that he was supported on both sides. We led him in the direction of the car, opposite of the direction he was walking in when we found him. He had obviously been weakened by whatever had happened to him, but what little strength he did have left he devoted to attempting to turn around and to continue in the path he was walking in before. Rebecca and I, with some force, helped him into our vehicle. "What the hell happened to him?" Nolan asked after he set the injured man down in our truck. I don't know, I responded, looking to Rebecca to see if she would say anything. She gave back an equally confused glance. "We'll get him to a hospital when we get back to Cairo. Our priority right now though is finding the others." We continued driving in the direction of the coordinates in silence, which was only broken by our guest occasionally saying one word, Yikis. None of us understood, but I have learned that Yikis is the Arabic word for reverse. He was trying to get us to turn around, and unfortunately, we paid him no heed. The sun kept growing hazier and hazier as we got closer to the site, but the events of the day had played tricks on our minds. We had believed that it was much later in the day than it actually was, which in turn caused us to not pay attention to what was in retrospect a very clear warning. We finally reached the site and were baffled when we saw nothing. I mean nothing. Typically, when ancient sites are reclaimed by the land, they form a hill in which everything ends up buried. This is how archaeologists usually get some indication of a site to concentrate on. In this case, however, there was just flat desert, barely even a sand dune. "If they're not here, then where are they?" Nolan asked. Rebecca and I shot worried glances at each other, then back at Nolan. He had a point. If we hadn't seen them on the way to the site, and they weren't here, then where could they have gone to? The only other option was that they're lost wandering in the desert, and given how vast and dangerous it was, they weren't likely to survive. Maybe they managed to get a hold of the police or for someone to get them, I asked. "We would have been told then," Rebecca quipped back, very clearly frightened by every possible outcome of the situation. "Guys, quiet for a second." Nolan shushed. We stood in absolute silence for a moment, with Rebecca and I giving Nolan confused looks. "Nolan, what are you?" I began before I cut myself off. I heard it. It was faint but getting closer. It sounded like hissing, the kind that a snake would make. Our concentration was broken by the sound of the truck door being opened. The man who we had picked up had stumbled out and was hysterically moving in the direction that we came from. There was too much happening at once. Our friends were missing the mysterious hissing noise, and now the mutilated stranger we had picked up on the way was using whatever strength he had left to get as far away from this spot as possible. That was when I noticed that the hissing grew closer the darker it got. "Guys, what time is it?" I asked, realizing that some things just weren't adding up. Nolan checked his watch. 3 p.m. he said, giving his watch and then the sky a look of confusion. None of us understood what was happening. It was almost close to twilight, with just a faint hint of sunlight in the sky. There was no question among us. We realized we were in way over our heads and trying to find our friends on our own. We headed over in the direction of the truck. Nolan got in the passenger seat and I got in the back, while Rebecca headed over to grab our nameless friend. The next part I have described to many officials, Egyptians, British, and Americans. My eyes had been gone for weeks at that point, so I couldn't see the faces of the Brits and Americans who interrogated me, but from the faint snickering I could hear in the background, I knew that I wasn't being taken seriously. Only the Egyptians seemed to at least take my story seriously. As Rebecca tried to grab onto his arm, a snake shot out of the sand. It wasn't any ordinary snake, it was only protruding maybe 8 feet from the ground. But just from the dimensions, you could tell that there was much more to the creature still below the surface. Rebecca turned around and faced this monstrosity with a wide-eyed look. She seemed to be paralyzed. The memory of what happened plays very slowly in my mind to this day, when in reality it all happened in less than a few minutes. The rest of the body of this massive snake emerged from the ground. It must have been at least 50 feet, but it materialized from the ground very quickly. As Rebecca stumbled backwards, the tip of the serpent wrapped its way around her, constricting her movements and bringing her closer to its face. One by one, it poked out her eyes with its forked tongue, savoring the taste as she shrieked into the empty desert. Then it ate her, all in one bite. One moment she was there screaming and struggling in its tail, and the next moment she was just a lump traveling down the gullet of this beast. Nolan was sobbing hysterically while I was in stunned silence. We both wanted to turn away, but we just couldn't. The man we had found earlier was stumbling away as fast as he could, but the tip of its tail found him too. When seeing that he was already missing his eyes, the beast disposed of him the same way it did with Rebecca. I was hoping that it didn't know we were in the car. I was hoping that it would just leave and that we could escape. I cursed at that moment, remembering that the keys to the truck were in Rebecca's pocket. It turned around to face the truck. Faster than I could curse, a thrash of its powerful tail had knocked the truck on its side, with Nolan and I being injured in the tumble. I laid there, unable to move when its tail entered the vehicle and wrapped around Nolan and pulled him out, the shattered glass of the window giving him cuts as he was dragged out. I closed my ears as tight as I could, but I could still hear his screams as his eyes were eaten, following by one final scream, and then silence. I lay there whimpering, knowing that it would come for me. I felt its tail wrap around me so tight that I could barely breathe. It took me out the same window as Nolan, giving me the same cuts on my extremities as it dragged me out. I was face to face with this ugly being, given barely any time to process the notion that I was about to die. It ate my left eye first. I shrieked in pain just as Rebecca and Nolan did as I was blinded in that eye, with the creature lapping up my eye in blood hungrily. Before it took my right eye, I could see light beginning to return to the horizon. I momentarily hoped that this would mean the end to my torture. It did, but not before it ate my other eye as well. I shrieked even harder as darkness consumed my world and as I felt the warmth of sunlight returning to my skin. I have no doubt that if the darkness remained, the giant snake would have consumed me whole as well, but I assume the light drove it away as it released me and buried its way underground. I wandered aimlessly in the desert in pain after that, having no sight. My shoes became filled with hot sand, and I could feel the sun beating down with me, and I was just ready to give up and die. Unfortunately, I was saved by a tribe of nomads, who generously took it upon themselves to transport me to Cairo. There I received some treatment and was transported back home to live a shell of my former life. I can no longer participate in archaeological digs or do many of the things I once loved. They make all these wonderful devices now which can read for you and write out the words that you speak. It's how I maintained some work as a historian and how I was able to get in touch with my coworkers from the university, who proceeded to let me know that more recent satellite photos appear to show that the site we were sent to investigate just vanished, as if it never existed. My Arabic isn't as good as Rebecca's was, but I could understand some of what the nomads who found me were saying. The word that kept sticking out to me was Apep. After doing some research on that name, I realized what we had stumbled upon. I knew what had killed my friends and what had blinded me. I realized then that the ancient Egyptians, with all their sophistication and knowledge, didn't venture to live out in the desert not because they couldn't. They were very capable. They didn't because they knew better. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.